Thanks for inviting me, and I'm always happy to talk about redwoods, so that's exciting. Um, and I will be talking about research that I've done with grad students at San Jose State primarily, and looking at stages of recovery in coast redwood forests following disturbance. For the most part, this presentation is focused on second growth forests recovering after logging, but I'll be talking about fire as well. And if anyone wants to delve deeper into the fire questions, I'm very happy to do that. So I'll just jump right in and start with things that you probably already know about redwoods, but why are they important? Why do we care? And a lot of reasons. The first thing I have on my list is ecosystem services. These are things that are provided to us and to all the other species in the forest. And watershed is one of those. Redwood forests are amazing at capturing fog and bringing that fog down to the ground, keeping the uh, forest moist and providing water for other species. Wildlife habitat, extremely important, especially with old growth redwoods. Very fortunate to have some of that in Henry Cow. And some of our famous redwood species are the northern spotted owl, dependent on old growth forests, our marbled murrelet, which I've only seen once, and I saw it surprisingly in the ocean, which was exciting. But a rare but very important bird, dependent on old growth also. Um, our salmonid species, which depended on the streams that are supported by redwood forests. Banana slugs, of course, everybody's favorite. And maybe the least known and most important species is the ewok. Okay, I'm just testing your generation here. Okay, moving on. Uh, Other values of living redwood forests. Carbon sequestration is something that's talked about more and more as we're trying to combat climate change. We're looking for places where carbon can be stored. And it turns out that coast redwood forests are the best potential terrestrial sink of carbon in the world. They hold more carbon than any other terrestrial vegetation type. So that's pretty exciting. And I have a little quote here. Ancient redwood forests store at least 3 times more carbon above ground than any other forests on Earth. Two mature redwood remove and store roughly 1,600 tons of carbon from the atmosphere, as much as the average American produces in a lifetime. So that's pretty good. If we could each have 2 mature redwood forests, redwood trees working for us, we might get somewhere. And it's important to make the point that this is living redwood trees that do this. Once you harvest a tree, this carbon sequestration ability declines. And there's been an argument made that timber products can store carbon, and they do for a time, but where a living redwood tree can store that carbon for thousands of years, um, even in the best situation, timber products are going to last a matter of centuries. So keeping them alive is an important part of the whole process here. As park docents and people who work for the state parks, you understand this very well. One of the values of living redwood forests are recreation and inspiration. And I imagine all of you who spend time in the forest take great pleasure in being there and enjoying the forest and the beauty of the forest and the peace it gives to us. So that is not a small thing. And then another thing we talk about is intrinsic value, and that's the value of these forests and the species that live in them in and of themselves, not necessarily what they are providing for us or what they are providing for other species, but just the fact that they are there being themselves is a value. And there's a famous philosopher, Arnie Ness, who you may have heard of. Uh, he and George Sesson were the deep ecologists. They wrote a famous article on deep ecology and the values of individual species. And so that's something to keep in mind when we're managing a forest. Okay, so those are some of the things that I find valuable, and there may be other things as well. That's certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's just something to start with. So the value of those living forests, and the old growth forests in particularly, which are the most natural of the forests that we have. In redwood forests, there's only about 3 to 5% of the old growth left, depending on how you measure it. And the rest of it has gone to primarily timber harvesting. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about this, you know a lot about it, and you talk about it in the parks. Harvesting began in the 1850s in California and went pretty much full steam up until the 1960s and 70s, and continues today. And even old growth timber. And my students are always shocked when I tell them that there's no rule against cutting down an old growth redwood tree, unless, of course, it's on somebody's property or it's hosting a murrelet nest or something like that. It is still legal to harvest old growth redwood. Okay, so I'm talking about recovery of forests and recovery from disturbance. So in this case, recovery from timber harvesting and from fire. And of course, in Henry Cow, you have both old growth stands and second growth stands. So you can see some of the second growth stands and the recovery firsthand. So we're talking about recovery from what? But we also need to think about recovery to what? What are we trying to gain through this recovery? What are we trying to get to? What we came from was an old growth forest. You can't really go back to an old growth forest. You can go, a forest can recover to the point that it starts taking on old growth characteristics and can support some of the species that have been lost. But a mature late cereal forest has all those characteristics, but it isn't, by definition, an old growth forest. An old growth forest is that has previously been never previously been harvested. And so this is a rare thing that can't be replaced. Old growth forests have a lot of different features beyond big trees. And I like to really point out that it's not about big trees, because some of our older forests, trees are not that large. I have a picture here on the slide. This is a old growth tree, over 1,000-year-old in Mendocino County, growing on the edge of the pygmy forest. And it's about 70 feet tall. You can see this individual standing there in the fire cave, and not a huge tree. And I've noticed on the perimeter of a lot of the parks in the area, as well as in Mendocino County and other parts of the Redwood Range, that at the edge of tolerance of the coast redwood, where it's in areas where it doesn't grow its best, we find these residual old growth trees because maybe they weren't attractive to timber harvesters. Maybe they were kind of out of the way. And so we have these little scraps of old growth growing in these areas. I've seen a few of these in Henry Cow up near the sand hills. I've seen some of them in Fall Creek going up toward the ridge and other places. So it's kind of hidden little gems like this. And they, while they might be smaller trees, they can still have many of the features of old growth trees that are beneficial for wildlife. For example, these basal hollows, big fire caves, big lateral branches. There's one up here. I don't know how well you can see that up near the top. Large snags are part of old growth forests as well. And those can be, relatively large, doesn't mean huge. And then one of the most important things are the associated species. Understory plant species, wildlife, fungi, invertebrates, all these other organisms that depend on the conditions that are created by old growth forests, and they are as important as the big trees themselves. All right, so there's my spiel on old growth and what is it. So to understand how forests recover after logging, um, my grad students and myself over the last 20 years have been studying natural recovery or unmanaged recovery in second growth forests, essentially seeing what happens if you don't do anything. And I think it's really important to know what happens if you don't do anything before you do something. Uh, if with a clearer sense of what works and doesn't work in terms of natural recovery, then targeting management options can make a lot more sense. So the first part of this research was done up in Mendocino County. I have roots up there. And my grandmother and grandfather had property up on Brewery Creek, which is now state park. It's part of the Mendocino Headland State Park, and it has the largest area of old growth on the coast of Mendocino County. So I kind of grew up there, and growing up there, I watched the forest develop. Now it's been 60 years, watching how it changed over time. And this got me really interested in this succession post-disturbance. I've listed names of a few of my star grad students here. Kristen Michaels is pictured here in a field of Woodwardia, and she was my first grad student when I came to San Jose State 20 years ago, and helped me extensively in this research up in Mendocino County. All right, here we go. Okay, so to understand natural recovery, we kind of have to understand natural succession, what we call stages of recovery following major disturbance. And there's an article published by a guy named Oliver back in the 1980s, which I thought really created a good framework for understanding this succession in coast redwood forest particularly. And it starts with this step called stand reinitiation, which is simply trees getting established again. And then it goes into a stage called stem exclusion, which is the forest thinning itself. And then understory reinitiation, that's where the little herbaceous plants come back in and other important species. And then finally into something like old growth again. I would call this a late cirral forest and not exactly an old growth forest, but something very much like it, hopefully. So in coast redwood forests, these are very unusual forests, which I'm sure you know, in that they are a coniferous forest that reproduces clonally. Not a lot of conifers can do this, and certainly no conifers do this on the scale that the coast redwood does. So stand reinitiation is relatively rapid and very strong following logging. You have hundreds and hundreds of sprouts that come off of log trees and start to reestablish those initial mother trees immediately, and without the trees themselves actually dying. So it's not a full stand replacement. It's a replacement of the stems above ground, but the genetic makeup of the forest remains the same, and trees are able to regrow given time and the right conditions. So stand reinitiation after logging is primarily through clonal sprouts, not generally through seedlings. So planting doesn't make a lot of sense in this forest type. Then the next big phase, and this is a really important one, is the stem exclusion phase or self-thinning. And this is where a lot of managers have gotten involved because they're concerned about the density of the stands. And why density is not so much of an issue for coast redwood forests, where it might be with other forests, is because of this clonal regeneration. What we're looking at in a coast redwood forest, when we're looking at stems, are really more like branches off of an original tree than like individual stems, individual trees that are competing. The sprouts off of redwood are not really competing in the same way that, say, fir or pine trees would be doing after a major disturbance in the Sierra Nevada, for example. In other forest types, you can have serious problems with forest density where very dense stand of recovering fir, for example, can all become sick and water deprived and then become susceptible to bark beetles. And then that can create a horrible fuel hazard and massive fire issues. Redwoods, not so much. They're all connected at the roots initially. They're sharing resources and they thin themselves out over time. And as they're thinning themselves out, the nutrients within those stems that are thinning can actually return to that larger clonal body. So it's a little bit different than most other forest types that we're used to dealing with. And because of that, some of the forest management options that we use in other forests are contraindicated in this forest type. So this is a little graph looking at a chronosequence of stands in Mendocino County, different parks there and actively managed areas, starting with stands that were 0 to 20 years old, 20 to 40 years old, 40 to 60, 80 to 100, 101 to 130, and then comparing that to old growth stands. And what you'll see is we have density on our y-axis here, and density declines over time.
You can talk.
Okay. If you look at this chronosequence. So higher density in 0 to 20, lower in 101 to 30, and that is very similar to what we have in old growth. You also notice, if you look at this, a big drop between 20 and 40 to 60. And we've noticed in a lot of stands that there's a sort of a period of time where the forest goes through a very heavy stand thinning phase. And that can be anywhere from about 40 to 80 years, depending on the stand. But after that, they tend to reach something closer to an old growth density naturally without any intervention. And here's a little photo chronosequence to make it easier to visualize. These are some 0 to 20-year-old stands. And looking at that, it doesn't look like a great situation. And you can see why forest managers might be concerned. But another 20 years later, and it looks like this. You notice a lot more open area and a lot of stems lying down. These are stems that are thinning themselves out after 40 years in the Coast Redwood Forest up in Mendocino County. Most of this was done in Jackson State Forest. All right, so we've got our 0 to 20s, our 21 to 40s, and then moving on, here's our 41 to 60s. You'll see still some trees laying around. The self-thinning is still happening to some degree, but by the time we get to our next phase, not really seeing that anymore. Starting to reach the end of that self-thinning cycle by 80 years. And then 100 years plus something very much in terms of density like an old growth forest. There's still a lot of things old growth forest possesses that the mature second growth doesn't, but in a lot of ways it is starting to resemble it, particularly in terms of density. So in terms of management, thinning, I would say thinning is a little heavy-handed and particularly contraindicated when brought into older second growth stands. Anything past 60 or 80 years would be, I think, be a negative in terms of the management, and in fact might lead to more clonal sprouting and then a need for more thinning after. So they thin themselves out very readily and don't really need help with that. This next graph is a picture of size classes in each one of these chronosequence of age classes. And what you'll notice is the size of the number of big trees increases with time, and the number of small trees decreases as well to some degree. Other things that change over time are canopy cover is something we're looking for. And we have a nice linear change in canopy cover over time, looking at these chronos sequences as well, increasing up to the old growth. All right, so that's exciting. How about tree density, canopy cover, and tree size? But there's other things going on in the forest besides trees. Um, and what I think are one of the most important indicators for forest health is the understory, those plants that are growing underneath the canopy. And up in these same stands in Mendocino County, and don't worry, we'll be moving to Santa Cruz County in a minute. But well, first thing we noticed was that non-native species cover, which was fairly high in the very young stands, declined rapidly and disappeared almost completely between 60 and 80 years. So the need to manage for those in stands that are recovering naturally, it's not too much of an issue unless there's other things that are bringing the non-native species in, like if you're in the wildland urban interface or things like that, that can affect the amount of non-natives you have. But in a naturally regenerating forest, normally these take care of themselves over time. Now, this series of graphs is a little interesting to look at, and something might have to explain a little bit. This is what's called a principal component analysis. It's an ordination where we kind of throw all of the understory species in together, and we see how they statistically group with each other. And these groupings, what we did is we used the different age classes in our chronosequence to group these species to see which species dominate each one of these stages. And we found, not surprisingly, that with each age class, there was a group of species, and that this grouping changed with time. Now we're at 40 to 60. You can see it moving across. Here's our 100 to 30, and then there's our old growth. So the grouping of species changes with time. And I know this can be a little confusing the first time I look at it. I'm going to break it down a little bit more in a minute. But essentially, the take-home message is that all these species are relating to each other based on the ecological conditions of that stand age. And now to stop looking at graphs and start looking at plants, we can see some of the species that we found associating with some of the later stages up in Mendocino County are here, and then here they are listed again, and you can see that not a lot of understory recovery for the Douglas iris and the vanilla leaf up until that very late stage, and then even then not so much recovery, very different in the old growth. So the understory are not recovering at the same rate that some of the others parts of the old growth forest are. At least these three were not. Looking at another three species, Calypso orchid, trillium, and our redwood violet, we found something a little different. And that was a nice kind of linear relationship with time and the density of these species in the forest. So they become very good measures of forest health because they track the change in the forest over time. And I have trillium outlined here because everywhere we go and we study forest recovery, we keep running into the same species as the ultimate indicator. So I'm going to be advertising for trillium today. Okay, so I promised some data from Santa Cruz as well. Instead of having the long chronosequence, what we did is we compared three different types of stands: actively managed stands in San Vicente, mature second growth stands, 80 to 120 years, right there in Henry Cow, and unharvested old growth stands in Big Basin, to see how they related in terms of some of these same metrics, and found that non-native species, not unexpectedly, were mostly found in the actively managed stands, and in the mature second growth and old growth, very little. And then looking at these understory species that I mentioned, again, we find a higher level in mature second growth and old growth, and lower level in the actively managed stands. So again, they are acting as indicators of forest development. Here's another one of those PCA's ordination, just to show that species in Santa Cruz also grouped up this way. Here you have our old growth. You notice the old growth and the mature second growth kind of grouping together here, and then the actively managed stand kind of moved over to the side, not hanging out the same way. And then another interesting thing we did in Santa Cruz that we didn't do in Mendocino, we did what was called an indicator species analysis to see which of our understory species, and we focused just on native species here, which of them related to each of these management styles. And we found a suite of species, both for the active managed, the mature second growth, had a lot of the species, and then for the old growth, 2 species, and that were associated specifically as indicators of old growth, and those were Trillium and Hooker's fairy bell, and both of them occurred both in mature second growth and old growth, but they were more strongly associated with old growth. So again, these species become very strong indicators of forest health, because if we have those species growing there, that means that in a way, this forest is beginning to represent an old growth forest developmentally. Okay, so I'll take a little breath. That's kind of the spiel on the post-harvest development. And I know I kind of went through it quick. I'm very happy to answer questions afterwards, but I just wanted to throw in a little bit about the post-fire recovery, because a lot of people are thinking about that right now, particularly following the CZU. People are wondering what's going to happen and how does this relate to other types of forest recovery. In some ways, it's similar, and it's only been a few years, so we're studying understory to see how that relates, but in some ways, it's very different. The main difference is that we have a different type of regeneration happening. For the most part, redwood survived CZU. And in other fires we've looked at in Redwood region, we've seen the same thing. Redwoods are incredibly resistant and resilient following fire. And so we had about 95% survival among redwoods, both old growth and second growth, in the CZU area. So that's very encouraging. Not so encouraging for Douglas fir. We had about pretty much the inverse of that. We had about 95% loss of Douglas fir in the high intensity fire areas. Other species, the hardwood understory or subcanopy species like tan oak, madrone, they survived from basal sprouts, but there was a lot of top kill there. But redwood pretty much made it through, and its canopy is starting to regenerate. It's going to be a relatively slow process, at least in human terms, but even after just 4 years, it's pretty amazing to see how much of that has recovered. So here's some graphs to illustrate that. We have percent survival, redwood here. This is survival basal or top canopy survival. We have tan oak, and a variety of other species, all of them above 50%. The only one that really hurt here is Douglas fir. And that is a significant issue in terms of wildlife habitat. And then trees with live crown, looking at live crown instead of at survival in terms of clonal sprouting, We have trees immediately after fire with redwoods with 47% live crown in the high intensity fire areas. And now going back there, this is bumped way up to about 80%. So I'm not too worried about redwood itself, but other things are being affected as well. This has to do with sprouting ability of these different species, and we have redwood sprouting back intensely more than all the other species combined, and then the number of basal sprouts. We also correlated with tree height, so it turns out that the taller the tree is, the more basal sprouts it has, which isn't surprising. But the big take-home news in terms of fire and redwoods, I think the most exciting thing we found, not just in Big Basin, but in previous fires as well, the Martin Fire, Mount Madonna Fire, we found big patches of redwood seedlings coming in after fire. And the reason I think this is ecologically important is because traditionally we think of redwoods as sprouters, as trees that reproduce from clonal sprouts. And when you reproduce from a clone, there isn't a great deal of genetic diversity spreading through the stand. After a big disturbance like a crown fire like this, we have this huge flush of seedlings, and these seedlings bring new genotypes into the forest. And the survival rate isn't very good with these, but some of them will survive, and we'll be tracking that. And I think it could be a benefit to the forest to have a greater diversity, particularly in light of climate change and everything else that's happening to the forest. So another little, this maybe is a giving away something. You asked me if everything was published at the beginning. This isn't published yet, but it's in review, and I think it's very exciting. So I want to share it with you now. We looked at this seedling generation, not just in the fire as a whole, but in Big Basin and areas that have been prescribed fire before the CZU and areas that had not received prescribed fire before the CZU. We found a larger number of seedlings in areas that had received prescribed fire. And I can't tell you why that is yet, but I think it is certainly an advertisement for trying to reintroduce intentional fire to the landscape. We also found that canopy cover was retained more in areas that had received prescribed fire prior to the CZU than areas that had not. So better canopy survival and just greater survival of trees as well. A higher percentage of living trees on areas that had received prescribed fire prior to CZU compared to areas that had not. So I find this very exciting personally. Looking at the prescribed area, fire areas, and in the fire areas as a whole, we see very little understory regeneration, particularly herbaceous understory yet at this point, but there are some hopeful signs. There are some trilliums starting to come up a Big Basin, but this is another thing I'm hoping to track very carefully to see when does this understory reinitiation really occur. And there's been a great deal of canopy cover loss there, so that means a higher solar radiation, drier soils, and it may take a long time for these to recover, but we shall see. But Trillium is our species to watch. In every type of disturbance I've looked at, I've found Trillium to be an excellent indicator. So when you see it, be sure to give it a shout out. And I have to give a shout out to my daughter Trillium. I'm a crazy Trillium fanatic, so we named our kid Trillium as well. So there she is, Trillium with a trillium. And just a few of the articles that we published in this area. If anyone would like to see any of these, please let me know. I'm happy to share. And some of the folks that have supported the research listed below.